Thank you so much for coming and to hear this rather depressing topic on how it is that the FDA should and does conduct some clinical trials. And doing this, I should mention at the outset that some years ago I received an email from a young man named Gideon Sofair who was suffering from Crohn's disease and who was enrolled in a clinical trial that was run under the supervision of the FDA. And it turned out he was put in the placebo arm and he died on early in January of 2011, and he might well have been saved by some of the drugs that have been given. Martin Cohen gave me the information, and I went back and reread the Wall Street Journal article, which you could find by just Googling his name online. And in some sense, this is a perfectly predictable outcome of what we should expect from the way in which the FDA runs clinical trials. The whole system of verification with respect to drug information is one that needs a lot of reconsideration and examination. And once we do that, I think one can see why it is that in this particular case, the FDA is probably the source of more pain than benefits. And in order to understand exactly how this system works, it's probably useful for me at the outset to give you something of the overall history of the FDA and the transition from its relatively modest powers when it was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 to the very comprehensive powers that it has had since 1962, when under the Kefauver-Harris bill, it was given powers to regulate both the safety and effectiveness of new drugs. Starting from the beginning, there was a huge ruckus over the purity of food, which took place in 1906, at the time that Upton Sinclair published his famous book, The Jungle. And in response to that, the United States Congress passed the first Pure Food and Drug Act. And in dealing with this act, the most important thing to understand is that the word purity had a huge role to play in the overall operation of the statute. Essentially, the only thing that the federal government could do at that particular time was to take those drugs and foods that were in interstate commerce, that is, were being shipped, and could seize them because they were either misbranded or adulterated. Under the sort of prevailing view of the Commerce Clause as it existed in 1906, the United States government had no power to control the regulation or to control or to regulate the manufacture of new drugs, because manufacturing was a local activity that was at that time not regarded as subject to the Commerce Clause power of the United States. That particular element changed in 1938 when the second of the Food and Drug Acts were passed, shortly after the 1937 revolution in American constitutional law. But the particular device that was put into place was relatively modest, because what happened is a drug company or a food company had to give some information to the FDA, and if nothing was done, then in fact the drug was to be approved to be licensed, and in fact no clinical trials were required. Generally speaking, what happened is you were asked to see whether or not a drug was generally regarded as safe and effective, or generally regarded as safe, rather, GRAS, and in 1962 they added to that the requirement of effectiveness. The question is whether or not a drug was generally regarded as safe and effective. When you start to work with these particular schemes, it's quite clear that if you just took the words generally regarded as safe and effective, literally, they do not seem to call for the use of any kinds of clinical trials. Rather, what they call for is that you get the sort of the general estimation of the profession in the United States and perhaps outside this country as to what should or should not be done with respect to a particular drug. And then once you have that particular kind of information, what you do next is simply let the thing ride and let's say some fairly clear indication that it's going to produce some adverse side effects of one kind or another. The passage of the 1962 Act created a real dilemma with respect to the way in which regulation was to go forward, because in effect somebody had to make a decision as to what to do with all of those drugs which were put on the market between 1938 on the one hand and 1962 on the other. They were out there without clinical trials, and the solution that was reached was that they could stay out there so long as the FDA did not require that they undergo various kinds of proofs. And generally regarded as safe and effective after 1962 quickly became very narrowly construed, so that essentially if you did not have clinical trials, the FDA could yank the particular drug from the market. So that what happened is a model of verification and proof, which was developed by statisticians, many of whom were in the FDA during the 1950s, became in effect in the 1960s the gold standard by which it is that various drugs and therapies ought to be approved in the United States. So in effect, if you want to sort of think about how this change works, the earlier system was a systematic hodgepodge. Drugs went on the market, people tested them, they used them, they liked them, they didn't like them. Some of them survived, some of them did not, but there was no pretense to an orderly kind of Cartesian sort of system in which systematic forms of verification were a precondition for getting things on the market. One way to understand this is to sort of think of it as an essay in a larger element of political theory. There are many people like myself who kind of believe that customary practices, random and disjointed, have a serious advantage relative to more systematic practices. A, they work a little bit more quickly, and B, what happens is they're decentralized kinds of decisions so that a single error by a single player doesn't shut down the entire machine or get you in the wrong direction. The clinical trials are a much more centralized kind of model, and what they require, in effect, is that a system of experts oversee the entire process, and they become essentially the source of a veto gate. If the FDA, which is considerable scientific expertise, does not approve of a new drug, nobody with a contrary opinion can use it. If the FDA, with its considerable political and intellectual expertise, decides that something may be marketed, there is nothing which says that anybody is going to be obliged to use it. So essentially, individual choice can, in effect, neutralize an FDA decision of approval, but it cannot override, for the most part, an FDA decision which says, in effect, that the drug is not to be allowed on the market. So what you do is you centralize the results. If you've got yourself a perfectly omnicompetent system that knows what it's doing, you should get better results. But the moment you start to introduce frailty and error, common conditions in the human mind and in political institutions, you have to be extremely doubtful as to whether or not this system is going to work. In order to make this kind of an evaluation under the new regime, it's actually helpful to lay out what the traditional steps and protocols are with respect to a clinical trial. And essentially, clinical trials in the United States today operate in three distinct phases. There's a phase 1 trial, which essentially is you give large doses of the therapeutic agent that is under consideration to a relatively small group of patients and see whether or not they live or die. And the essential argument in this particular case is there's no point in going on with clinical trials with respect to those kinds of drugs which have immediate and pronounced adverse effects, so you simply rule those out. Once it turns out that a drug or a chemical entity passes this particular kind of test, then there are two other trials, both of which are conducted on a double-blind basis, which means that the patients themselves do not know who's in the trial on the one hand, and the physicians who treat them don't know who's in particular groups on the other. And the explanation for using the double-blind is the moment you start to know who you are and where you fit within the system, it's going to introduce all sorts of biases with respect to the result in terms of the level of care that you're given and so forth. So the double-blind requirement essentially falls into the category of scientific precaution against systematic error that might otherwise be introduced by biases known to either the investigator on the one hand or the person who is subject to the investigation on the other. And the stage 2 trials are relatively small, although they take a fair bit of time in order to conduct themselves. And if these things turn out to be successful, then you go through a larger stage 3 trial, which may itself have several thousand people in it and may in fact take a great deal of time. The question is, how good is this particular mechanism at dealing with various kinds of systems? And the answer is, I think it's just a mixed bag. There are certain cases in which clinical trials work extremely well, and that one ought to be quite insistent upon their occurrence, and there are other cases in which the results are much more complicated and difficult to understand. Let me see if I can kind of give you the break. If you're trying to figure out how to organize a system of medical care, a lot depends upon the kinds of conditions that you're trying to treat. So for example, suppose what you're trying to do is to develop a new antibiotic which deals with a drug, say a staph infection, or rather a condition like a staph infection, which if it's going to kill you or cause serious difficulties, is going to do so within a relatively short period of time. Under these kinds of circumstances, clinical trials actually work pretty well. You give the drug. If it turns out that it has a really strong adverse effect, you take it off the market. And then when you try it, you're going to have a fairly large number of people who will be subject to this kind of condition. You'll get your results as to whether or not their condition improves or doesn't improve within a very short period of time. And generally speaking, once you get that kind of information, you can make an intelligent choice as to whether or not to continue using that particular product on the one hand or getting rid of it on the other. Whether you need clinical trials in this area is another kind of consideration, because even if you just didn't do a clinical trial, all the information that you want is generally going to come relatively quickly. So if you think back to the 1930s and the first generation of wonder drugs, nobody needed a clinical trial to tell you that penicillin was going to do wonders with respect to certain kinds of infections. And by the same token, when you had the various mycin drugs, aureomycin and streptomycin and so forth, these things were not subject to clinical trials before they went on the market, because essentially once you put them out into the field, you would get very accurate feedback very quickly, and the whole thing would come to a conclusion one way or another. So the irony that you have to say about clinical trials is the very type of condition which makes them relatively effective is the kind of condition which also makes them relatively unimportant. If you have a situation in which cause and effect are relatively clearly linked in the field, as it is in the laboratory, everybody's going to be able to make the same judgment. And so, for example, if you were to do a systematic study of drugs that were introduced into the market in 1938 to 1962, it's not as though every drug that was introduced in 1938 is going to be on the market in 1962. There's going to be a powerful selection mechanism based upon the experience that individual physicians and groups of physicians have with certain kinds of treatments. Some of them will disappear from the market and others will thrive. So by the time you get to 1962, and you're looking at the set of drugs that have been on the market somewhere between 1 and 24 years, it's not a random subset of the drugs that have already been introduced. Quite the opposite. It is a rather carefully culled subset in which all the ineffective drugs are put to one side, and the ones that generally work pretty well relative to their adverse side effects are the ones that turn out to survive. So essentially, in these particular cases, it's not that clinical trials do a great deal of harm. It's also, on the other side, they probably don't do a great deal of good. The real issue with respect to clinical trials comes up with respect to those things which are long-term degenerative conditions where you don't have this kind of short-term clear response that lets you know whether or not a treatment which comes in is going to be effective or ineffective. And sort of exhibit A with respect to this type of condition is in fact a cancer drug, because there are multiple different types of cancers, often which present in very similar ways, but have rather different genetic type of operations. The number of things that can affect the way in which a cancer grows is very large. If you start to administer one kind of drug or another, you're never quite sure whether or not the effect that you see is one that would generalize across cases, or indeed is true with respect to the particular case in which the whole thing starts to be observed. So in these particular cases, if you're going to try to run clinical trials, it's of necessity a much more complicated type situation. And what happens is you have to run it for several years on both the phase 2 and the phase 3 stage in order to figure out what's going on. In the meantime, since you're running these trials off of patented commodities, these entities, in fact, have a 20-year patent life, and that can easily erode in clinical trials because the patent will start to run even though the drug is not being licensed for sale. In 1984, the United States Congress passed a rather important piece of legislation, commonly known as the Hatch-Waxman Act. And what this statute did, in effect, is to suspend the operation of the patent laws for a period of up to 5 years in order to allow some kind of an allowance for clinical trials. Back in 1984, most clinical trials were under the 5-year period. Today, with ever-increasing standards of stringency imposed by the FDA, these trials often take a great deal longer to run, so that the general statistic for a blockbuster drug today is that you're lucky if out of a 20-year patent period, you get yourself somewhere between 9 and 11 years of actual marketable use, all of which has to take place a long time after the drug is patented, so that we can say quite confidently that interest and capital costs for running this particular operation consume about half the cost of developing a new molecular entity today, and these costs are roughly estimated now at something over $1 billion, probably closer to $1.5 billion, depending on the discount rate that you use and the period for which you've observed. The difficulties, however, with clinical trials turn out to be very, very serious, and let me see if I could point some of them out to you, and then you can start to see what the response has been on the private side with respect to their operation. Well, the first thing that you have to note about a clinical trial is that when you do this thing, it just takes a dreadfully long time to be able to get and to interpret the results. There are now, therefore, two types of error that you have to deal with. One of them is that you're doing the Lord's work. You run these long clinical trials. You discover that the product is no darn good anyhow. And then what you do is you keep it off the market so that nobody else is going to be hurt. But on the other hand, if in fact the drug that you keep off is one that has a great deal of therapeutic promise, then in effect for each year you take it off the market, you're going to have the kind of situation that applied with respect to Gideon Sulfair in his Crohn's case, is you keep a drug off the market, somebody dies for want of being able to participate in one of its trials, and then 6 years later the drug turns out to be approved. So at that particular point, what you have to do is to reckon the social cost as all those individuals who were essentially denied life-saving treatment or life-extending treatment during the period that this particular drug turned out to be in the FDA trials. And if you're trying to figure out which of these two particular errors turn out to be the greater, the answer is it's almost always the second one. If it turns out that you got yourself a schlub drug that's sitting out there, there's usually going to be other kinds of evidence available which will let you know that the drug is no good to begin with. So for example, if somebody has tried a sister chemical and it has failed, generally speaking, you say, hey, this class of chemicals doesn't look to be all that good. Maybe what we ought to do is to back off and to go somewhere else. Or if in fact one of these drugs has been approved overseas and it dies for want of a stable commercial audience, that's also further information that inside the United States you ought not to use it. And then of course there are all sorts of other studies that one can do, many of which have to do with the pharmacokinetics of a way in which a particular drug operates, so that if you know something about its proposed mechanism, you could speculate as to whether or not when that mechanism is put in vivo, that is inside the human body, it's going to have a positive kind of response or a negative kind of response, so that what happens is, before you get to the clinical trial stages, the drug companies, armed with all of this kind of information, will generally select out those particular drugs that are likely to fail when that information is not based upon clinical trials, but based on this wealth of other evidence that is available to you. So that the drugs that go through clinical trials are the ones on which the companies are prepared to put a bet. And they well know that even if you get drug approval for something, that doesn't follow that anybody's going to use it thereafter if in fact its combination of therapeutic benefits on the one hand and adverse side effects on the other tilts very sharply into the negative direction. So a priori, knowing you're going into a clinical trial, the only honest estimation that you could make is if you've gotten as far as phase 2 or phase 3, there's pretty strong ex ante evidence that this is going to be a drug which on balance is going to give you greater positive benefits than negative benefits, so that the delay now turns out to have fairly high cost associated with its particular operation. Now, everybody else in the world knows this in addition to the FDA. And so what happens is you start to see a very powerful dynamic that takes place as people are constantly trying to figure out how it is that they can game the system in order to improve their overall life. And this has all sorts of ramifications. One of them is just the simplest device, is that what people do with serious conditions is they file pleas to the drug companies on the one hand and to the FDA on the other hand for what is called a compassionate exemption. And what these compassionate exemptions do is they say, look, we have looked at this stuff. Every known treatment has failed with respect to the person in question. They're on their last legs. If they do nothing, they will surely die and suffer greatly from it. Let's give them a chance to see if we can play this. And the FDA's response with respect to these particular applications is generally chilly and hostile. And the explanation for it has to do with the charm and romance that they see with the clinical trial. The moment it becomes clear that experimental exemptions or compassionate exemptions will be given on a routine basis, the FDA understands what everybody else understands, is that the willingness of people to enroll in clinical trials, where, like Gideon Sulfair, they may well end up in the placebo arm, will go way the world down, so they will not be able to maintain the numbers inside the United States in order to be able to make these double-blind studies work. And so in order to forestall that kind of opportunism as it sees it by individuals, you have to be relatively tough on the compassionate exemptions if you really think that the gold standard with respect to these things is in fact the clinical trial that you're going to have. So you will see routinely a chilly kind of exception. This is also extremely painful for other reasons. Clinical trials, they're like any other trial. They all begin on an appointed day. In order to be eligible for a clinical trial, you have to meet certain kinds of protocols, because the only way these trials work, if they work at all, is to be pretty sure that the populations in the two groups are evenly matched. So if somebody has multiple conditions, they may be ineligible to appear in a clinical trial. Or if the trials begin only on January and it's now March of the previous year and you have 6 months to live, it's not going to do you a lot of good to have to wait 9 months in order to participate in a trial, at which point you're going to be dead anyhow. So when you start having these chilly kinds of responses, for some people there's not even the option of joining into a clinical trial. It's just simply waiting hope against hope that something of this particular sort will move quickly and you'll be eligible to the drug. What happens, therefore, in many cases is you start to see migration. People will say, look, some of these drugs are now in use elsewhere. We've made our individual choice that it's better to take the drug with all of its known and unknown risks than to simply die passively. So it's off to Switzerland, Egypt, Iraq, which actually is a place where you can get lots of these treatments and so forth, and try as best as you can to find something like this overseas. This will introduce an obvious wealth and knowledge effect. Some people will be able to afford this, other people will not, but you will certainly see, in effect, people emptying out of the American system precisely because, as an individual matter, they have made a perfectly rational choice that they have a better chance of success and survival if what they do is they get the treatment, then wait for the FDA to run its particular results. This, in turn, has created a kind of a political response. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a woman named Abigail Burroughs, or what is now called the Abigail Alliance, but it's very instructive as to how crazy this particular system can be in particular cases. Abigail, she died some years ago, was a 21-year-old girl, I think, at the time of her death, who suffered from a rather acute kind of cancer. Doesn't matter what type, because I never remember. And what happened is their parents desperately tried to get her enrolled in a program to use a drug called Erbitux. And it turned out that the FDA had not approved it, and consistent with the FDA situation, most of the drug companies are not easily prepared to dispense these drugs because they don't want to run the wrath of the FDA on the one hand, and they're worried about a liability system which simply does not accept waivers from harm by individual patients as being valid. So they argued, they yelled, they schwitzed, they did everything they could under the face of the globe, and sure enough, the day she died is the day that the drug arrived for her potential use. Daddy was not amused by this particular situation. And so what they did is they formed the Abigail Alliance in an effort to see if they could break the gridlock which was associated with clinical trials. At the beginning, what they did is they tried a constitutional lawsuit, which actually had some early success in the District of Columbia Circuit Court. Judith Rogers and Doug Ginsburg, the latter being a former student of mine and a graduate of this law school, essentially argued that as a matter of constitutional right, individual autonomy was so important that the FDA and its asserted police powers could not protect any individual from taking a drug that he or she wanted to use, at least if they were under the guidance of a physician, and at least if they had gone through phase 1 trials. And both of those conditions are relatively trivial to meet. There are very few people who want to take drugs who have absolutely no chance of success on the one hand, and there's nobody who goes into cancer treatment today of any degree of sophistication who thinks they're so good personally that they're going to ignore the advice of their doctors. And so sure enough, what happens is they bring this lawsuit, and by a 2-to-1 majority, it turns out that, as I would like to say it, the good guys win. The case then goes up on bank into the entire D.C. Circuit, and Judge Griffiths, who wrote the dissent, comes into the majority and writes a resounding affirmation of the FDA's power under the police power to make sure that nobody's going to be harmed by dangerous drugs. And so therefore the protective function of the FDA is given an enormous degree of deference. These judges claim, well, we don't know the first thing about how medical systems work, mainly because they don't try to understand it. And so what happens thereafter is whatever the FDA says goes, and if you want to insist upon clinical trials, you can insist on clinical trials. Now there's a subtext here which I think is well worth noting, which is if you go back and you look at the Abigail Alliance, one of the questions you want to ask yourself about them is whether or not these hysterical parents have in fact any skill in picking the kinds of drugs that they want to use. And we do know the answer to that question, and it's quite effective. Every single drug
which the Abigail Alliance has urged for general use, has eventually been approved for use by the FDA. So it's a perfect record. And what this kind of suggests is that the information that you get by putting things together here, there, and the other place is actually extremely valuable, and that the cost of running the FDA system has to be measured in the lives that are forfeited by the way in which these things start to operate. Now, why is it in many cases so difficult to figure out what's going on in these cases? And here's something else which I think is of extreme importance. It's not just delay that you're worried about when you're dealing with clinical trials. There's a very important issue of variability with respect to the way in which different people respond to different drugs, which confounds the trials. That is, we do not exactly know what the mechanism is, but all kinds of tumors that fall within the same class do not at the genetic level have identical coding. And it may well be, and we're learning more and more about this through the study of what is called personalized medicine, that a standard drug may work for one subtype of a given cancer, but not for another. So that when you start to look at the overall results, they may well not be particularly persuasive. But if you could identify the appropriate subset, it may well be that even though 80% of the population doesn't benefit from the use of a particular product, 20% of the population does. Now, if in fact you use the hook by crook method, which I'm a great defender of, that 20% will eventually identify itself. People will look at drugs, they'll discover that they don't work. Somebody will take this one. The doc will say it doesn't work in 80% of the time, but you may be one of the 20%. And by the time you try it, it may give you remission, and in a few cases may also give you some degree of cure. So essentially, by making individualized determination based upon rather comprehensive knowledge of what the physician and patient have of their own condition, you can often pick out the outliers and treat them successfully while doing relatively little harm to the rest of the people inside the sample. So that the combination of these two effects, the delay in effect with respect to drugs that have broad spectrum use, and in effect the delay with respect to those drugs which may have a powerful niche for which they are working, are in effect two very heavy costs that are associated with the per se ban rules that are generally adopted with respect to the way in which these drugs get on the market. Now, the thing to understand about this, and I'll become more clear about it in a second, is the moment you are dealing with drugs that are not on the market, it turns out that the veto gate that the FDA has is extremely powerful, and everybody has to go skulking about the corners to see if they could get some exceptions or move heaven and earth to try to figure out how it is that you can get the FDA to push a little further. On this last point, the history has, I think, been very, very discouraging. Not understanding that other forms of information are of genuine value, what the FDA often does is it continues to elevate the clinical trial as the sole form of reliable information, even though, in effect, if you get through a clinical trial, you still don't know when you have individual patients whether or not these more complicated conditions are going to make that drug effective, if effective, how effective, and so forth. So a huge amount of post-clinical trial approval is necessary to fine-tune and to tailor these particular drugs for individual cases and to fit them within larger kinds of protocol. So what happens under these circumstances is the trials, in effect, just keep getting longer. So now you have to do separate trials on men and on women. But it's harder to do trials on women, particularly women who are pregnant, because you can't include them in these things. Then you have to use subgroups with respect to pediatric indication. Then you have to start creating subgroups with respect to race and so forth. All of this stuff gives you additional information. But it's never the question as to whether or not by more trials you get more information. That's almost a truism. The question is at the margin whether or not the delay and the cost of trying to run these more exhaustive trials gives you information that's worth the losses in question. And if we know everything that we do know about the track record with the drugs that have been held up beforehand, they're moving in exactly the wrong direction because they never understand that the purpose of a clinical trial is to see whether or not when you let something out on the market it might do some good. And if the drug has already been out on the market and has done some good, why rely on the clinical trial when you have all of this downstream information which essentially can form as the basis of further decisions? So you say, well, is this just speculation on the part of a worthy law professor who knows absolutely nothing about how medicine works? And the answer is no. And there are two reasons. One is after you spend enough time teaching something about the FDA, you actually learn something about how medicine works. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's no more difficult than federal jurisdiction in many ways to figure out how some of these things start to fit together. But more importantly, you don't have to rely upon what you as a law professor know about other drugs. What you start to do is to see what happens when, in fact, drugs are released into the marketplace. So what's the key element that we have to use here? There is right now a very powerful exception to the general jurisdiction that the FDA has over the uses of drugs in the market, which is the FDA is not by law allowed to regulate the practice of medicine. And the practice of medicine has been construed to say that once a drug is on the market with respect to some particular purpose, any physician may at any time decide to use it for any other purpose that he sees appropriate. So to put this into place, what happens is when you get approval for a drug through clinical trials, the FDA's caution first policy says that you only get its approval with respect to the treatment in certain dosages of certain kinds of tumors. So you may get an approval for one kind of dosage with respect to a breast tumor, but it's not going to be approved with respect to colon cancer or with respect to melanoma or anything else of the sort. Well, now you're sitting out there and you're told that this drug is on the market and it's been approved, let us say, for colon cancer, and you've got a very resistant case of breast cancer. The question is, what are you going to do as a doctor? Well, one of the things you could say is, there's the old FDA, and they've decided it hasn't been proved for that. Since it's not proven safe, it must be dangerous, so therefore I'm not going to use it on my patient. Any physician who did that today would actually be guilty of medical malpractice, in the strong sense of the word, legal. Why is that? Because all the other forms of information that we have, which are ignored by the FDA, cannot be ignored by any particular physician. So just take a simple thing. The guy puts the two things under the microscope and sees the kind of the molecular construction of the various tumeric cells and says, these things are sufficiently similar. It's worth a shot. And so what you do is you take the drug, which is approved for condition A, and you lard it on to a patient for condition B, and then you decide whether or not this thing is going to work, and if so, you continue or not. Well, the moment you start to see this, the obvious objection is, who are you kidding? Do you think that any individual physician working with samples of one can actually make intelligent judgments as to whether or not when you use this so-called off-label use, the treatment itself has a modicum of effectiveness or not? And the answer is, if you're playing this thing completely chaotically, it's really very limited. So the question then is, what do you do about it? One result is to say, give up all entrepreneurial invention, realize that single actions themselves are incomplete and inconclusive, and do nothing. Not wise. So what do people do? Well, you pool information, right? Because the moment you start to pool information, you get an N that looks a little bit bigger, and what you have is this known of anecdotal jurisprudence. One case, doesn't seem so good. And the guy down the block tries it. Two cases, seems a little better. Somebody across town tries it, a little bit better still. Then somebody puts it up on a website. I used X drug on Y patient and it seems to work. And all of a sudden somebody in Zanzibar is going to use this thing as well. Well, how do you harbor and distill all that information? And the answer is you do so by the creation of intermediate voluntary institutions. And these have already been formed in virtually every major medical subspecialty that you care to investigate. And if you're talking about cancer, there are about 6 or 7 of these organizations. I cannot tell you about their relative competence or expertise, but I did spend a fair bit of time trying to track down one particular organization called the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which essentially, in good de Tocquevillian fashion, operates as a responsible kind of information intermediate. And so what happens? Well, first of all, you've got to get some kind of organizational structure. And they manage through voluntary contributions from foundations on the one hand and a healthy dose of physician time on the other to create these sites to which every single person is now entitled to report in real time the consequences of using a particular drug for a particular off-label use in a particular dosage with the results in question. And this would include, of course, not only the good stuff, but also what is called very ominously in medicine adverse events, so that if it turns out that a particular dosage on a particular tumor at a particular time for a particular patient doesn't work, you can now code that. Unlike the stuff that you get through the FDA, which is you may use this drug or you may not use this drug, one of the things that you get is really precise information about, for example, drug interactions, which is a key part in medicine, which says, well, I used this particular drug to try to treat that tumor, but I didn't give them that drug, and they really got sick as a dog. And somebody else said, well, I put two drugs together, reduced the dosage of the first, increased the dosage of the second, and all of a sudden the side effects were tolerable, and the effectiveness of the drug was much greater. And a lot of what medicine is taking stuff that is already approved by the FDA in kind of blind and stupid form, and then figuring out how it is when you manipulate dosage and drug interactions, you can create a chemical cocktail which is more effective than any of the individual components in higher dosages when it turns out to be used alone. So that what happens is this particular organization gets all that stuff in, and it not only gets it from domestic sources, which the FDA only looks at, but it can also go international and collaborate with similar networks in other nations to increase the number of N and to increase the number of circumstances in which you have information about how these drugs work. At this point, unlike the FDA system, you actually get a very powerful feedback loop, because as people start to realize that this information is valuable, they start to rely on the source, and when they start to rely on the source, most of them reciprocate by contributing information back, so the databases start to go. Whereas if you tell the FDA, oh, I have found an adverse event with respect to a drug, they treat you like you're a semi-criminal. You have to tell us everything about it, write the following reports. Spend $20,000 of your own time and money in order to tell us what's going on, because we got to know the whole truth, the truth and nothing but the truth. So you get these kinds of situations. And what do you learn? Well, you learn a lot more than you learn from an FDA approval. And I've already mentioned one thing that you learn is about drug interactions and about the frequency of adverse events. You also learn this off a much larger database than you could have for any third-stage clinical trial. And you also learn it in the field where you don't have matched pairs, so you can start to get information, however cautious, about idiosyncratic cases and the way these things ought to be handled and they ought to be managed. So the portfolio of information that you get is very much stronger. In addition, what you start to do is you get much more information about sequencing. If you're talking about cancer drugs in particular, they're first-line treatment, second-line treatment, third-line treatments, and so forth. And essentially what you try to do, quite humanely, is first you figure out the standard treatment with seems to work in most cases at relatively low dosages and with relatively small side effects. And if that then fails, you go to something which is a bit tougher but has worse side effects, and then you may go to a stage 3 thing, because there's no free lunches in this world. If there was a drug, right, which was more effective and less toxic than something else, you'd always put it first. So what happens is you start taking more and more prudent risks. So how does this then start to play out? Well, the FDA has the following response to this information. Doctors can talk about it. Doctors' organizations can talk about it. But if drug companies talk about it, they're engaged in criminal conduct. The explanation is this is a medical thing. If a drug company simply takes a study which appears in the New England Journal of Medicine and puts it under the Abbott label and says, here it is, docs, go read it yourself, this is now the form of illegal promotion of an unauthorized use of a drug in question, and the fines that can be landed upon you for doing this can be up into the $500 million, that's billion, not million, $500 million range or even more, because the FDA thinks that the protection of its own jurisdiction dealing with respect to clinical trials is so important that if it allows drug companies to promote off-label uses, essentially the entire approval process will be completely circumvented. They are right about the consequence. They are wrong about its desirability. What you really want to do is to get this information out there as fast as your little legs can carry you, because many people are not in the care of cancer specialists at the time that they manifest conditions. And if this kind of information going to a GP will move people into the specialist network that much more quickly, you will be able to save many more lives. But the FDA, unfortunately, thinks much more about its own jurisdictional prerogatives than it does about anything else. How good is this information? Well, there's a debate about that, because it's not double-blind clinical studies. But on the other hand, you can't get any physician to back off of its use. The reliance on this stuff is totally universal, and off-label uses for many kinds of drugs now actually constitute as much as 80% or 90% of the use of the drug in question. So clearly somebody thinks that something has gotten out of this, and I think the informal mechanism suggests that you're going to do okay with it. And in fact, what happens now for insurance reimbursement purposes, nobody cares about the FDA's want of approval. They care about what the NCCN and other organizations start to think. And for malpractice, this becomes the standard of care, so that you're in this odd position that you're guilty of medical malpractice if, in effect, you only used approved drugs in the manner for which the FDA tells you that their approval is going to be warranted. So what does this start to tell you? Well, the first thing it starts to tell you is the off-label use drug does not occur in a vacuum. You have to pass a phase 1 trial, and you've already done that, and you have to go through phase 3 with respect to at least one use, so that the success of this particular program, at least in part, depends upon the fact that you've gone through a little bit of this FDA program. The hard question is, suppose you just back off 2 and 3. The question is, what is going to happen? And this is what I would predict would happen, is that your off-label uses in their initial runs would in fact be a riskier endeavor than they would have been if you had had this other information. Because essentially the success in this current situation is conditional upon having all the other information that I've referred to. On the other hand, you're going to be moving much more quickly with respect to this mechanism, so the chances are that by the time you go 2 or 3 years, whatever the shortfall is with respect to the permissibility is going to be made up by the greater field experience. So that in the end, what will happen is that the initial off-label uses will come earlier, be of somewhat higher risk than would be the later off-label uses. But the correct comparison is, would you rather make an off-label use of a drug which has gone through only phase 1 trials, at which point all label uses are off-label, or would you rather wait? And I think, in effect, this is the whole problem that you face, is that anybody who's making a rational individual expected value calculation will come up with the conclusion, better to take a chance because the downside is so low, given that I'm going to die anyhow, or be suffered to serious things. And what happens is the FDA is always thinking that it's working in the interest of long-term science, which it treats as being in opposition to these short-term egotistical individuals who have the nerve to want to live by getting their preferred treatment. And the problem is they are so ignorant of the way in which clinical trials fit into this larger mosaic of information, they get it wrong on both points. There's nothing which says in certain kinds of cases that somebody can conduct a clinical trial if it turns out that it's really, really, really important and pay people to join in it. But my own guess about the situation is you will see relatively few cases in which it turns out that if left to their own devices, people will want to either participate in these trials or, in effect, drug companies will want to run them. They're slow, they're unreliable in their own peculiar way, and in fact, the tragedy that takes place when other sources of information are disregarded simply is too great. Now, how should one reform this stuff? Well, my view about the FDA is that it should not have a monopoly on what drugs get into the marketplace. I'm quite happy to allow them to require phase 1 trials. I think everybody else would want them to be happened anyhow, so it's not a big deal. The second thing I would do is I would make it very clear that you can sign binding waivers as a cancer patient, so that if you take a drug and there's an adverse consequences, you're on your own. You cannot go back and sue the drug company. That's just another manifestation of freedom of contract. And from an ex-ante perspective, everybody will sign them. From an ex-post perspective, everybody will breach them if they're allowed to do so. Well, it's your ex-ante self that really matters under condition of uncertainty, not your ex-post self. You ought to be able to do that. And then third, anybody and everybody can give whatever warnings they want about it. The only people I don't want to warn about this stuff in many cases is the FDA, because when they start to give warnings, oftentimes the rigidity of their warnings gets you exactly in the wrong place, because they heighten the negatives and downplay the positives. And when you're trying to figure out what expected valuations are with respect to use or non-use, you don't want hysterical caution. You want dispassionate and honest information. But even if the FDA gave information, the whole point is that people are free to disregard it and rely upon other sources of information, which is exactly what happens today. The FDA warnings are a huge source of potential liability in the tort system, because even though the organization is known for excessive conservatism, in litigation, all warnings that are issued under FDA guidance are inadequate for the harms involved, so that people can now sue with respect to the conditions in question, which I regard as something as a large disaster, which keeps more drugs off the market. So essentially what you want to do is to open up this system. And ironically, the system that you had in 1938, where you didn't have mandatory clinical trials, and you let this stuff go out in relatively chaotic form, will probably produce fewer casualties if you take into account both the errors of letting wrong drugs on the market and keeping good drugs off the market than the current system. And what's the footnote to this? What do you think is the latest wonder drug for treating various forms of multiple myeloma? Why, it's nothing other than your old friend, thalidomide. What happens is thalidomide is a death machine if it's applied to pregnant women in the first trimester of pregnancy. But it is also the treatment of choice with respect to a rather pesky form of cancer with a very high mortality rate. And this is one of the few drugs which was actually put back through clinical trials after the effectiveness of it was found through random use on leprosy patients, which is the way in which this thing began. And this kind of gives you the lesson. If it turns out you let something as dangerous as thalidomide on the market, in the end, you can sort this stuff out in a reasonably coherent fashion so that you have the easy and powerful counterindication, while at the same time you have other positive indications that you could then use. The FDA is a bureaucrat. It is too slow. It operates only in Maginot Line fashion. Either you cross this line or you don't cross this line. It simply does not understand how multiple sources of information matter. And what it seems to do, therefore, is to create a gold standard out of one source of information which is subject to many kinds of shortfalls. And what it really has to do, and what we have to do, is to rethink this situation from the ground up. And I hope for all those people who've died thus far in vain, I fear, that we will eventually come to realize the craziness of this particular policy and try to get more decentralized information and less government monopoly control over the way in which the FDA is now allowed to do its business. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I have a question. So what happens when you find out that under the great stress of, figuring out what you're going to do with a life and death decision, that you figure out that people overestimate systematically the benefits, underestimate systematically the costs? You've introduced a huge portion of systemic risk into the system that wasn't there before, and what you end up with, I think quite respectfully, is chaos.
Well, why is that not true with respect to off-label drugs?
Off-label drugs?
Yeah, off-label uses of drugs. If what you're doing is say these are all uses which have not been sanctioned by the FDA, they are all situations in which the risk of overestimation of benefits and underestimation of costs are possible. And then the question is, how does it take place? And the answer is, thank God, behavioral economics does not run the world in terms of description. And what you do is, if you go back to Abigail Alliance, it wasn't that she and Dad decided what they were going to do. They had the best physicians they could find at Johns Hopkins University recommending exactly the treatment that the FDA denied them. And so if you're correct, we should not allow any physician or any patient to make any particular use of an approved drug, because what are they going to do? They're going to overestimate the benefits, and they're going to underestimate the cost, and we're going to get chaos. I just don't think it happens that way. I think what happens under these circumstances is, if you put people in completely unstructured environments, send them off to Mexico in order to take Laetrile, you'll start to find those cases. But at this particular point, the individuals are aware of both of these biases, and that's why they hire professional help in order to guide them. And so then what you have to do is to ask yourself, even if this bias were true, what about the other bias? It is perfectly clear that the FDA, for bureaucratic reasons, overestimates the kind of negative stuff and keeps drugs off the market, and underestimates the positive benefits. And oftentimes they have moving goalposts with respect to the way in which they run these clinical trials. There is at this point a complete blood feud between the FDA and mainly patient user groups with respect to the drug Avastin, which has an off-label indication with respect to breast cancer. FDA wants to stop the early approval that was given to this thing when it went through one of these expedited stuff. Genentech is fighting it. All the patient groups are on the Genentech side. And so what you have to do is to really ask yourself whether or not the kind of a priori statement that you just made bears any relationship to what's going on in these settings. If you've ever spent any time with anybody who has cancer or any other chronic condition, what you discover is, far from them being crazy, most of these people develop sufficient knowledge about the condition from which they labor that they actually contribute positively to the physician in figuring out what the appropriate treatments are. Because they know how to respond, they can figure out what the comparisons are, they can give you relatively detailed estimations of various kinds of side conditions and so forth. So I think you're right to mention that this is a risk, but I think you're desperately wrong to think that it's a trumping risk. Other risks are much greater, including the systematic biases that the FDA has to make sure that all the bodies that are buried are those who didn't take any drug, rather than have a few people who suffer from side effects. So to give you but another example, it is very clear that the best and most powerful drug available for treating blood complications after surgery is none other than your friend Vioxx, which is already off the market. And you just go one thing after another, and generally speaking, I don't think that if you actually went through the drugs that are kept off the market here, see what happens after their market, see what happens when they're marketed overseas, you'll come to a conclusion which is different from that. You go to any group of physicians in private, okay? Not public, because they're afraid of revenge. And this is what they will all tell you. The FDA holds back medical research in the United States, and then you fill in the gaps. 2 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years, 4 to 6 years. I cannot think of a single physician that I've ever met who in private has said that they have thought that the protective functions of the FDA has contributed anything to the positive good in the United States. They will not say that publicly because the ability to take revenge on people is extremely powerful if you've got a veto gate position. So I urge you to reconsider your position. Yes?
And can I ask a follow-up? So would you be for constraining this elevated contractual ability to people who are actually on their deathbeds?
No.
Or would you do it for? Would you draw any line at all?
Well, I mean, when you're dealing with cancer cases, that's all the line that you need. As far as I'm concerned, I just want to get rid of this stuff. That's all the line that you need. What I would simply say if you wanted a requirement is that no person is allowed to sign a waiver unless advised by a physician. Because that's the condition which gives you some protection. It's going to be universally satisfied anyhow. But the amount of harm that takes place by not allowing contractual waivers with respect to the use of drugs under any circumstances is enormously high, and it's measured by the people who don't get the treatment to begin with. Let me give you but one other example. There is a drug out there known as Prozac, and Prozac treats very seriously depressed children who are at risk of killing themselves anyhow. Right now, you put a kid on Prozac, any time that you do that and the kid dies or suffers serious mutilation injuries or something of the sort, the company will be sued. There is no warning that you could put on a Prozac bottle which in effect will survive scrutiny as a matter of law in any court. And there's no preemptive power with respect to the FDA. So what happens is, after they lose some of these cases, in response to the litigation, rather than to any medical evidence, the FDA puts a black box warning on there. And the black box says, physicians, you start to use this stuff, you better be very, very careful to make sure that this thing is right. The problem is when you put a black box warning on something, it hurts a doctor trying to defend themselves in a medical malpractice case. Why? Because now you're taking a very great risk. Why don't you try something else? Talk to the kid, or whatever else it might be. Well, we now have pretty good information that the number of teen suicides is up since this new regime has been introduced. And it may well be that Prozac does kill some people in transition. But suppose it kills 1 and it saves 20. Is that any different from killing none and saving 19? It's the net difference that you want. The causation is relatively immaterial. It's expected value that drives this. And so the entire institutional framework has essentially pushed this drug off to the margins when it was the best known available treatment. This is not what you want to be doing by drug policy. It's great for plaintiffs' lawyers because now you get some malpractice cases. But it's not great for everybody else. And I would rather have more people alive and fewer people with compensation than running this kind of crazy system where the compensation through the tort system is the most erratic thing imaginable. You can still win a case in torts. That's no help. It just means you get more litigation and more uncertainty and more confusion. What you need in this area is, if you've got systematic information, is bright line rules which make certain conduct legal or illegal. You do not need to go through this litigation charade on the hopes that somehow or other through litigation you will get information. You just don't get that kind of information from this kind of litigation. Next question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Professor, you give a very positive account of the sort of mechanisms of decentralized information sharing, say through websites or other voluntary mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Now, what I wanted to ask is, it seems to me that as sharing of information gets easier and easier mm-hmm. in the internet age, it seems that the sort of end product we end up with is often worse and worse in other contexts. And I mean, you could think of conspiracy theories and things like that.
Well, think about it.
Which go crazy. Sort of the more information is there, the sort of worse decisions people seem to end up with, the less closer to the truth they end up by. And I'm just wondering why you sort of, particularly patients, I mean, it relates to the last question, particularly patients who are in any case in an irrational and sort of vulnerable state of mind. Yeah. Why you think these dangers wouldn't come in?
But look, again, I mean, a danger there always is, but the question is the probability and severity. First of all, as I said, the moment you start with decentralized information and it's on small ends and isolated persons, it's not very good. So what people do is they try to share information. And it's the intermediate organizations that you start to have that essentially pool that information and reduce the variance and give you more reliable results. And what the point here really quite simply is, no sane person in dealing with any kind of cancer treatment thinks that he or she has the repository of information in their own skull, that they're not going to seek other information. And what I'd want you to do is to explain to me why it is that the information sets that we put together through the NCC and otherwise are of negative value. Don't tell me they're perfect. I'm not going to claim that. All I'm saying is that they have a positive expected utility and that the information incentives will drive it the other way. Now, what about the individual people? Well, you know, I have all sorts of conspiracy theories about who killed John Kennedy, right? I lived through all of that back in the 1960s. You know, it was one guy who did it, and by the time we were done, the technology got good enough so that what people thought were gunshots were something else. And nobody thinks that the Warren report was wrong today. But the reason why those things flourish is, suppose I'm wrong. What difference does it make to me in my day-to-day life? If, on the other hand, I'm wrong about whether or not drug X or drug Y is a better treatment for me to take when I'm having a second-stage melanoma, at that particular point, I got a real interest in that. And so conspiracy theories aren't going to really help me very much. So I'm going to try and figure out how I knock this stuff down and improve it. And what the internet does essentially is, in these cases, it pulls positive rather than negative information. To give you another illustration, which I didn't stress, is on the patient side. You get very deadly, low-frequency, rare conditions. So there's 6 cases in the United States, and there are 14 in Brazil or whatever. You actually could get an internet site together, usually in English, which will get 80% of the 240 people who have that, and they start sharing information up and down. Now, if you want to go ahead and tell me what these people are doing is trying to figure out how to kill each other in harmony and happiness, be my guest. But I think what you really start to find is that every time somebody has a piece of information, they put it out there. Nobody claims that it's the entire structure. But each person says, hey, it may be a piece of a useful mosaic. And after you've done this for a year or 2 or 3, you may get more. I don't know if you ever lived with people who've had family members who've had long-term debilitating conditions, but they go absolutely crazy. My mother-in-law, for example, many years ago died of myasthenia gravis. And the whole family organized various kinds of groups and benefits and studies of one kind or another, patient support groups, grateful patients who survive and not so grateful ones who die of this. They're an enormous source of information. And having watched this up close and having read about it in other circumstances and spending constant amounts of time talking about this with physicians, drug company advocates, and so forth, even listening to FDA people who don't tend to talk to you, I might add, what you find out is that these sort of spiraling irrationality stories that I'm hearing on both sides of the room are essentially low probability events, and that the sort of mundane accounts, which says that the aggregation of information by interested people will on average improve the results, is in fact a correct analysis. And we know that the FDA is wrong because we know in effect that they approve drugs and delay is essentially a cost. And if you delay a drug for 10 years, and you do this in terms of present discounted value, you're knocking out a huge proportion of its value, screwing up the patent system, screwing up individual lives. And when you talk to these people, all they can do is point to the cases in which they were right. And they ignore all the cases in which they are wrong. I mean, I've never seen an official from the FDA actually in combat with somebody who's determined to destroy him, like myself. Stand up. They don't do it. They always speak ex cathedra. Let me give you, we ran a conference on oncology at the AEI. Myself, I'm Richard Miller and Jack Calfee, who just died. And we invited Von Eschenbach, who is the commissioner, and a good commissioner as these things go, the FDA, to speak to us at lunch. And let me tell you what the conversation was about before we all leave, right? So he gets in there. He doesn't hear anything in the morning where everybody from the medical side was down on the FDA. And he gives the standard team cheer. He says, and I'm going to give this speech. I'm here. And we all have our differences. Patient groups, drug company groups, physician groups, FDA. But we're all in this for the benefit of the patient. And so what essentially he does is he gives the good motive speech for 15 out of his 20 minutes, saying everything we do is done with the right idea, and that everybody ought to understand that everybody else is in this with this one cardinal virtue. So I'm listening to this absolute palaver by this perfectly competent commissioner. I mean, he was not a bad commissioner as these things go. So I don't represent anybody, right? So I can ask the odd question. So I said to him, you know, you didn't come this morning because like all great officials, you have something else to do rather than to listen to people who know what they're talking about. I was not very kind. I said, but if you had been here, you would have seen that there was not a single professional physician who did anything but lament the way in which the FDA policies managed to slow down improvement. So what do you think his response was? I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm sure you only asked that question because you too only do so for the benefit of the patient, right? So essentially you get this kind of filibuster that starts to take place. There was a panel the next day of former FDA commissioners, and they essentially, I was the moderator, and all of them said, we don't agree with that guy. Now why do they say that? Because they're still bucking for government jobs. In case you're curious, nobody will ever put me on the FDA. Although I think I make a wonderful commissioner. And it's exactly for that kind of reason. If you go to Washington, I mean, it really is another world because there is nothing that people will not sacrifice for the prospect of political advantage inside the system. And if you're inside the system, what you cannot do is utter things which essentially are the mark of Cain, the curse, the death. You take on the FDA head on, you can never work for the FDA. And you can never work before the FDA, and you can't be somebody else. What you can do is you can litigate the hill against them, only with respect to organizations that are trying to bring it down. I don't even do that. But it is a very powerful kind of guard in which the byword is incremental reform, right? Incremental as it never happens, which is what they are arguing about all the time. There was an old man in the audience on this occasion, this was some 3 years ago, and he looked at one of the FDA commissioners who was standing up there, former FDA commissioners, and says, you know, I went to a conference in 1974, and everybody on the panel said exactly what they're saying today, and in 34 years, nothing has happened. How do you explain that, right? Well, they offered no explanation because the bureaucratic rigidities are really in place, and this is an organization, either you blow it up, or for the next 34 years, you're going to have exactly the same kind of situation where this sort of highly dubious centralized science on the clinical trial will essentially become the gold standard from which everybody else will suffer. And there are just enough counterexamples out there and enough theoretical arguments to point out what I think is surely the case, is that we have to rethink our views of clinical trials and FDA supremacy from the ground up if there's to be any real success. Right now, we are spending more money and producing fewer new chemical entities than ever before. If you look at the major shops, they're all closing down on their research, trying to specialize. If you look at the little shops, they don't have the resources to carry these things through. It's a major, major type of sclerosis of the mind and body. And all I can see, particularly in this administration, but to some extent even in the last one, is people saying, well, all we really want to do is to make sure that no bad drug ever gets on the market. And the only way you could achieve that lofty result is to make sure that no good drug gets on the market either. Okay, thank you.